start the fourth of these talks on the Once and Future Parish, which is called What Holds Us Back? Parish Problems. So I could talk about what I call parish pump problems. I've listed a few of them there. Warring feuds in your congregation, inward-looking, unhelpful, disheartened congregation, congregation at war with the vicar, difficult, lazy, weary, disheartened, overworked vicar, vicar with too many parishes, really hard, resistant soil, no money, no new worshippers, while the old die off. Now, I'm actually going to deal with these problems of relationships in the final two talks. So I'm not going to talk so much about these kind of personal and relational problems as the kind of large cultural shifts today, rather than the local challenges. And practical responses are not today's topic so much as what holds the parish back. So you're going to have to wait for the last two talks for my attempts to suggest solutions. I think it's important, first of all, to acknowledge that the story of the church in the 20th century is not one of simple continued decline. In the aftermath of the Second World War, for example, the Church of England saw some striking growth and seemed to be in touch with the popular mood. This was a period of continued rationing and hardship, but of great hope in a new Elizabethan age. It saw the arrival of the welfare state, which was rather like the secular arm of the church, as a universal provider in which we all had a stake and all had rights. And of course, it was a future Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, who was the first to use the term in print, long before his elevation in a work of 1928, in which he opposed welfare state to power state as one which served the flourishing of all its citizens. And the Butler Education Act of 1944 and the National Health Service owe a considerable amount to Temple and his friends R.H. Tawney and William Beveridge, with the latter's report published in the same year as the Malvern Conference, which Temple chaired, which looked ahead in wartime to national reconstruction after the war. And it's in that idealistic context that the church, as a national institution, locally grounded, achieved some significant post-war growth. A Gallup poll of 1946 saw 83% of the population identifying with one of the mainline churches, and that rose to 90% in 1963. In the late 40s, just under half the population never attended church, while in 1963, 75% attend church occasionally, they claim. And it was the Church of England who then enjoyed the lion's share of affiliation, as well as baptisms, weddings, and so on. And this is the kind of Church of England in which I grew up, with a provision of social activities, busy Sunday school, and robed choir in most churches. I grew up in a council housing. Well, I didn't live in it, but I went to a council housing parish, St Luke's Portsea, and they had a robed choir. This was the era of socially concerned parish priests, like Bill Sargent of St Mark's Portsea, who started a housing association and led colourful processions through the busy streets. Curates in St Mary Portsea regularly broke up fights outside their curate house on a Friday night. While certainly no idyll, working class Portsea was an area which witnessed lively and engaged ministry in the inner city, well respected and confident. And this assuredness was a wider phenomenon, and nationally the numbers of worshippers would be maintained above 2 million till 1970. As Andrew Brown and Linda Woodhead point out, in their insightful, if trenchant work, How the Church of England Lost the English People. The success of the Church for so many centuries has lain in its ability to remain articulated with English society, not just by running alongside it like a page before a stagecoach, but by helping it sustain and understand itself. And the society I grew up in was one that was relatively secure in its new post-war unity and focused on the common good. So at my senior school, our motto was from Joshua, "Be ye strong and very courageous." We were encouraged to fulfill those words by our integrity and service. Church, school, and society appeared to share common values, and our lives were experienced as relatively integrated by today's standards. Oops, I don't know quite what's happening here. Should be another one. There it is. Paul Avis writes that the relation between society and church is actually reciprocal. Their destinies are linked together. The Christian community and the wider community are in the same boat. And I think after the war, there was this great feeling of coming together. And so society and the church sort of both experienced it. Well, the church has witnessed an enormous loss of members since the times I'm describing, and has lost the will, the authority, and the ability to perform this integrating role. Though you might argue it's still trying with its idea of a social care covenant only this week. The reasons for the decline are hotly contested by sociologists. Callum Brown, who questionably tends to cast the 1950s as a period of repression and conformity, emphasizes the revolt of housewives in the 1960s as they took on more paid work, ignoring the overwhelmingly capitalist imperatives that were newly requiring them to do so. Other scholars notice increased mobility and the ability to go on car trips on a Sunday, as well as the advent of television. One scholar recalls how the Forsyte saga destroyed Sunday evening worship. The sexual revolution had its part to play, along with the general turning away from traditional modes of life and behavior, as well as the growing lack of respect for elderly people and elderly institutions. The heroic generation became increasingly the object of ungrateful satire. In a culmination of this cultural liberalism, a succeeding economic liberalism finally permitted shops to open on Sunday in the 1990s. And this, above all, changed the character of that day immeasurably, altered the entire character of the British weekend overnight. The familial and the sacred were increasingly swamped by the commercial and its accompanying solitude. I can remember when it happened. I was living at Cambridge at the time, which I know is a bit churchy anyway, but it felt as if one week I was in one kind of city and the next week I was in a totally different place. David Martin, very distinguished sociologist, questions the universality and inevitability of the secularization narrative, which looks rather different, at least up till now, from a global perspective. Moreover, Tom Holland, in his recent work Dominion, concludes that secularism itself is indebted to Christianity. It is, if you like, a kind of almost Christian phenomenon. Without it, without Christianity, that is, he writes, no one would ever have got woke. Yet all agree that from the 1960s onwards, we entered a period of more global and freewheeling capitalism, in which the individual trumps the relational and consumer choices define people's identities. Now, the question is how far the Church of England responded to this undoubted enormous challenge. Are Brown and Woodhead correct in arguing it's the Church which is responsible for losing the English people? Have we colluded in our own marginalization? To a degree, of course, an answer yes to these questions would confirm Martin's questioning of the secularization process as inevitable. Now, I'm going to try and suggest that theology, in my book, I also talk about liturgy, and we might discuss that afterwards, are important drivers, and that the story is not one of simple and inevitable Christian decline. If I were to narrate that topic, I would have to go back to the Enlightenment, in which religious claims were not just put under scrutiny, but denied their place at the philosophical high table. For Kant, religion was a matter of merely practical reason. And for the Enlightenment philosophers in the 18th century, much traditional religious practice was just called superstition. Despite the challenge to Enlightenment rationalism by various shades of postmodernism, in the last 50 years, we still live under the shadow of its unreconstructed ideology, for which ancient ways of life and practices are to be superseded on principle, because change is always presented as progress and necessarily an improvement on what went before. But of course, new ideas and methods are not necessarily better. I vividly recall years ago having tea with an elderly academic couple in Cambridge who provided us with virulent neon-coloured slices of angel cake, which tasted of cardboard, and answered with great glee how much cake had improved now the fuddy-duddy days of baking your own were over. Little did they dream that the next century would unveil the Great British Bake Off. We still live today in that Enlightenment culture which promotes progress as a virtue, while at the same time denying the underlying teleology that would give one a sense of a goal for which to strive, a telos, because there can't be one in a purely material account of reality. If you are a materialist, there is no meaning to anything, so you can't talk about goals in life in that way. So we have a secularizing society in which the habits of listening to or watching religious programs, which were 56% of people did that on a Sunday in the 1950s, attending worship, or enculturation by school worship and teaching, have atrophied. The Bible Society report in 2014 found that 61% of children do not recognize the parable of the Good Samaritan. 40% have never heard or read of the crucifixion. 46% of their parents did not realize that Noah's Ark is part of a Bible story. And as we live in a culture in which individualism is the driving force, aptly written about in Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. People do not participate in sports, trade unions, political parties, in anything like the numbers of the past. And that's the point that Paul Avis is making. We talk about the numbers going down in church, but they're going down in everything. Society and church kind of go together. In the past, in part, this is the effect of everyone, including women at work, and poorer people sometimes holding down 2 jobs. But the rise of digital media means many more people are on their own in their room online or playing video games. Now, of course, social media can promote community, but more often isolate, which is something I notice among my students. They are far less connected and friendly with each other than they once were. All these are real challenges that make the sustenance of a parish church an heroic act. And then we have the fact that because numbers of people going to church have gone down, that an even smaller number of people are sustaining what is often an important and ancient building. The Church of England has 45% of all Grade 1 listed buildings, and the parish churches among them are left alone to finance repairs and maintenance. In 2021, according to Save the Parish website, where they told us about their Christmas services, the tiny parish of 100 souls in Ouston in Leicestershire raised 95,000 to repair the spire, tower and east window of their church. And in 2022, another 21,000 to repair a bulge in the east wall, all without any support from the diocese. Now, there used to be a dedicated stream of lottery funding for religious buildings, but it was stopped a few years ago. This burden means that much time must be taken in fundraising. And the argument is that this takes time from mission. Indeed, some senior clergy wrote to the Church Times during lockdown, arguing that online worship would wean people away from buildings, while some openly want to get rid of them. Dioceses already have plans to close 368 in the next few years. And if the mechanisms for closures are made easier, they would close many more. So the question is, as I put on the slide, buildings, burden or opportunity? You may not be surprised to know that I believe they are a resource and an opportunity, and that even being responsible for their upkeep can be of value, though not always. And indeed, the threat of the closure of a parish church can actually rejuvenate it, as in Neasor, in my own diocese, where the wonderful widow of the church warden went round putting notices up everywhere, telling them their church was in danger, drawing people to its defense and leading to a larger congregation than ever before. They have 60 to 90 now attending the 6 services they're allowed a year, and even a new choir. I know of several examples where non-churchgoers or even non-believers have joined the PCC so as to rescue their church, and even then been drawn into its worshipping life. Fundraising too can be missional, as it forces people to think about why they're doing it and draws all sorts of people in to share the work. I'm not trying to underestimate that it can kind of kill some people. And I do think that we need to do something to support people. I believe we need a royal commission on parish churches, since it's so unfair that the burden falls on very small communities when they're of immense national significance. But it gives agency and purpose to a congregation to have their own church to look after. But thirdly, buildings are themselves missional, as I know from my own cathedral, and I'm going to say more about that missional role and how we can increase it in my final talk. But the fourth important thing about buildings is that they are not ours to sell off and deny to later generations. You know, once you've got that money, you've got it, and that's it, and you spend it, and you've got nothing. And we have no right to destroy our heritage for it to become a private house or a business. Now, it's true the Victorians sometimes built too many churches, some of which we could lose, but you need to be careful that a church does not represent a living and defined natural local community, because for it to be taken away tells people in that place that they're not a place and that they have no value as a community. The fact that the church seeks to close churches is just one example of a mindset that encourages decline and internalizes secularization. There's a complete failure of nerve among our leaders, and it reveals itself in a number of areas, of which the attitude to buildings is one. But the first I've got on this screen is in the curriculum for church schools. The Church of England is proud to say it educates 1 million children. 1/4 of all primary schools are Anglican, besides 228 secondary schools, and 15 million people living today were educated in those schools and academies like this one here. Yet at some point, they gave up teaching the Bible in any sustained way, or we wouldn't have this appalling level of biblical illiteracy. As church schools, they have always had the power to set their own curricula in religious studies, but they failed to do so. They tend to take the local one. Now, it's quite possible to teach Bible stories as stories rather than as modes of evangelism. And the Bible Society offers those magnificent 150 individual Bible story-based assemblies, Open the Book, which have been approved for key stages 2 and 3. Although good parish priests will spend as much time as they can in their local schools, this is no substitute for core lessons. So how did it happen that schools abandoned the sustained Christian teaching I experienced at a non-state school in the 1960s and early 70s? There are several reasons. First is the fact that many of those teaching the children today don't know those stories themselves. Our problem is that communal memory is lost among adults and teachers feel unconfident about teaching such material. Secondly, RE specialists will have been taught religious studies in its methodology, with a presentation of religion by practices, worship, and buildings, alongside some minimal presentation of beliefs. You normally get the parable of the Good Samaritan, but that's about it. It's unlikely to include a major study of the Bible or of Christian thought, or even of the Christian year as part of the living life of a school. It's possible to study the Bible for RE at A level, but it's rarely attempted. Thirdly, although Church of England offers a rich theological account of what education is for in its vision statement, hitherto it's offered no curriculum content about how those aims will be achieved. This is beginning to change. They brought in something called Understanding Christianity. I don't know if any of you know about that, which is a great improvement on what we have, but is still teaching it very much from the outside. It has some stories. It's quite sort of thought-based, but it's still much, much better than anything we've had before. But I think this is the reason why things have got to such pretty pass, that we haven't had anything like that offered until now. It should have been offered 40 years ago. A fourth reason is that confidence has been lost since the 1950s through a denigration of tradition and an anxiety about the nature of the faith and its promulgation. The church educates children from a range of backgrounds and faiths and is often the only local school available. In such a context, there's been a shying away from overt Christian content to the curriculum, lest Muslim children, for example, feel excluded or under pressure. Yet usually people of other faiths value enormously the fact their children are in a faith school. And in the case of Jews and Muslims, many of the Old Testament stories are shared. Hindus traditionally are extremely open to other religious stories, and the Sikh scriptures themselves are highly hospitable to figures and elements from other religious traditions. Sikhism is inherently syncretistic. So it seems to me we've kind of failed to make use of our fact that we are a religious school. Now, they have got a little sculpture here, which is called Acceptance, and it does include a little cross, see there, with my pointer. But it's kind of typical, my own local Church of England secondary school, which even has a junior house for gifted musical children and the choir at the cathedral, has no Christian symbols to speak of in the school. There is a sort of, you look carefully at the notice outside, you can sort of discern there's a kind of cross shape, but that's it. You know, we're not really making the most of the fact we've got these schools. The second way in which we've internalized secularization is the cult of progress for progress' sake in the church. If something's old, it's bad. If something's new, it's good. The parish as an ancient institution is necessarily problematic and is routinely described almost disparagingly as inherited church, and thus something, as I said in my talk to Save the Parish, that ought to be consigned to the attic, like an embarrassing present you've been given by a great aunt. But only because it's old, as if the church is always newly descended from an ideal heaven and had not been established in time by Christ to be indeed inherited by us. As C.S. Lewis says, I put it on the slide, we all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you've taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. The turning away from all finite turnings of time and place, which are the only available ones, is the most fatal deviation of all. The incarnation reveals to us that the givenness of our physicality and our mortality, our human limitations, are creative opportunities hallowed by God himself. So the parish is blamed for the decline in religious practice. And the idea is that something new must be better. Now, while it's wholly right to regenerate practices and respond creatively to societal change, ditching the core activity of the people of God meeting to worship is outdated, well, it's just a death wish. You can compare it with pubs. Pubs are also suffering from a decline in the numbers of people using them and closing. No one suggests that they do not have value because of this fact in the way that they do with the parish church. Nobody says, oh, well, you know, pubs are out of date. We want pubs. Pubs are a wonderful resource. But nobody kind of thinks that. They just, I mean, they do think that it's about the church, that they won't accept the same argument. So the third way in which the cult of progress for progress' sake in the church is accompanied by the worst aspects of secularism is in individualism. When you look for the aim of vision and strategy, the Archbishop of York says this: the overriding aim for the future is that any worshipping member of the Church of England, when asked by their friend where they could go to explore their faith, would be able to recommend an expression of church locally that would really suit them. The only aim here, in what's supposed to be a kind of vision document, is that of personal choice, as if selecting a brand of cereal in a supermarket, as I've rather kind of obviously illustrated. But with the trajectory away from parish ministry and the threat of mergers and closures, the smorgasbord of choice will not include the parish church among its possibilities. As so often, the prioritizing of choice, the idea you could choose a new worshipping community, of fresh expression, a plant, and so on, or the parish, is itself covertly selective. The promotion of choice in food outlets, for example, tends to ensure that the market renders your local pub reachable by foot, no longer viable. And the same for your local butcher or anything like that. Now, there are three priorities given below these words I've quoted, which are more substantive. To become a church of missionary disciples, be a church where mixed ecology is the norm, to be a church that is younger and more diverse. But even these are proximate goals and put the focus on altering the nature and constituency of the church rather than on an evidence-based delivery plan for converting the young, empowering and enriching the formation of believers, and so forth. Bizarrely, for policies in flight from traditional ecclesiology, instead of taking the institution for granted and working from it outwards, the language is all about church as such. And it's all too clear that the assumption behind the words of vision and strategy is an unexamined notion that the parish church may not suit many people. As I said, this is the secular language of consumer choice. It's a curious marketing strategy which goes headlong in quest of the categories of people which evidence suggests are least likely to be its customers, while expecting to keep existing takers for the product. Many retail chains have foundered thus. Well, since the whole point of the parish system is it's for everyone, offering a liturgical round suited to the real needs of all, whether they know this or not, this undermines faith in the very DNA of Anglicanism and its liturgies. There have always been chaplaincies, but they too instantiate parochial values. They're often quasi-parishes for a defined group, who are necessarily distinct from ordinary life, the prison service, the armed forces, though providing the relief for chaplains and volunteers of making someone other than themselves responsible for building care. By contrast, the language used by the Archbishop is that of elective individualism. Explore their faith, suit them. It's not confident about promoting the Christian gospel, but suggests it as one possible mode of self-development. Vanished from this attitude is any sense that Christianity is already fitted universally to the deeper spiritual needs of all. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk about where this apologetic attitude to the parish comes from. I believe it's the outworking of particular theological trends in the 1960s and beyond, though its roots go back to the Enlightenment and the rise of historical criticism in the 19th century. And I'm going to be very controversial here because I'm going to suggest that one very considerable factor is the considerable influence of the heroic German Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was executed in the Nazis in 1945 for his part in a plot to assassinate Hitler. His great friend carefully preserved the letters he wrote from Tegen prison and published them with the first English translation in 1953. The letters are personal and highly speculative as they begin to imagine how to live a life of faith in a post-war world. Bonhoeffer takes his Lutheran theology of the cross to such an extreme that he envisages what he calls religionless Christianity, in which we share Christ's suffering by plunging into a godless world without any veneer of religion. Now, whether Bonhoeffer would have changed or clarified his words had he lived, we'll never know. His martyrdom, as it came to be interpreted, gave his last will and testament, as SEM described it in a recent blurb, immense authority. In his study of what he calls English Bonhoefferism, Mark Chapman names John Robinson of Honest to God, that famous book of 1963 that sort of critiqued all sorts of traditional ways of thinking about God. He names him as just one of those captivated by the letters, but I would argue he was one of the most influential, making Bonhoeffer a prophetic voice. Bonhoeffer was deployed in Honest to God to justify a turn away from care for the religious and towards a ministry defined by the secular. This was the practice in the Diocese of Southwark at the time, so-called South Bank religion, with Nicholas Stacey's radical social initiatives and his eventual withdrawal into social work. God was now supposed to be not present in the churches, whose deity was the traditional out there God, but the churches were not worth keeping, at least in their present form. Christ was already imminent in the secular world at a satisfactory end of history, and all the church had to do was, I quote, to give voice to this latent Christian tendency present in all people. And you can see this in the language today of vision and strategy. What the people needed to be saved from was no longer sin, but the supposed staleness of religious language, customs, and liturgy. Well, there is much to admire in Bonhoeffer, especially in his earlier and complex theology. But I would argue that the uncritical reception of his religious Christianity, usually taken out of context of the confessing church under Nazism, has been pernicious and has meant that for 50 years and more, there's been a theological warrant for regarding the worshipping congregation as somehow lacking and traditional forms as ambiguous. I heard a bishop I will not name at a recent conference I was at refer to the rump of believers, and I'm sure Bonhoeffer lurks somewhere behind his view. So I've given you a quotation, which I've only finally got to on the sheet, from Honest to God, but it's quoting Bonhoeffer. This is what Bonhoeffer wrote, but it's quoted approvingly by John Robinson. The only people left for us to light on in the way of religion are a few last survivals of the age of chivalry, or else one or two who are intellectually dishonest. Would they be the chosen few? Is it on this dubious group and none other we are to pounce in fervor, pique, or indignation in order to sell them the goods that we have to offer? This, Bonhoeffer argues, is where the contemporary church operates. While one can sympathize with the desire not to exploit the vulnerable, there's very little confidence in the value of the current congregation here, who often include as many who are staunchly or imaginatively heroic as are weak or resentful. Yet those who need or practice the faith were already being regarded as a dubious group or as intellectually dishonest by Bonhoeffer. You can still see this language used today, as in Barry Hill's 2021 Church Times comment piece, which claimed that for decades, the primacy of the congregation has been one of the Church of England's most pervasive institutional sins, from which many other sins concerning power control and defensiveness flow. He believes that caring for the congregation has downgraded outreach to the whole community. So modes of fresh expression are needed to reach them, though he gives no reason why this should be so, except that church culture is problematic. This seems to mean liturgy. What goes along with this denigration of the existing congregation is a theology, curiously not unlike that of F.D. Morris's, which views the non-religious as latently Christian. Morris believed the sacraments of baptism revealed the true identity of the person as child of God, rather than effecting a new identity by adoption. Yet in contrast to Morris, who wanted everyone included in the church, too often in the liberal and liberal Catholic wings of the Church of England today, this can be employed to affirm and confirm non-believers in their secular self-sufficiency. As in John Robinson's vision, they have come of age and are beyond the nursery reading strings of religion. In consequence, this all too English Bonhoefferism justifies ignoring people in the pews while merely smiling benevolently on those outside. Leads to an ambiguous attitude to the faith in which you apologize for it and for imposing it on others. And I've heard sermons doing this many a time. Mark Chapman quotes Valerie Pitt, who'd been associated with the South Bank Theologians in their journal, but fell out of love with its religionist vision and denigration of parish life. She says, "It is worth inquiring whether the withdrawal of our talents, of our love, from all the disturbing, irritating, misguided pew fodder isn't one of the reasons why it's so provincial, so closed in a sub-Christian world." And she suggests the way forward is to initially withdraw into it, though she notes sardonically, for a while it will be dreadfully provincial, like the Lord's life in Galilee, which was dead provincial at the time. In fact, the disciples, we know they weren't working class, they were kind of small business people, just the kind of people you get in the pews. Chapman has sympathy for Pitt's mission because, unlike Brown and Woodhead, he doesn't think the problem is the church has abandoned her national task of reflection of the currently dominant English identity. He thinks religionless Christianity was a last-ditch attempt to do just that and to render the whole country, even in its self-enclosed secularity, as obscurely holy. His view is in synergy with the bold thesis of Sam Brewitt Taylor, who claims in his Christian Radicalism in the British 60s that Robinson and his South Bank friends invented a British theological form of secularism, embracing politics, egalitarianism, and liberal sexuality, which they then made available for other players. So he thinks the church invented the 60s, basically. Most significantly, he thinks it was Christians who were the first to claim the modern age was secular, following Bonhoeffer, and that these radical Christians are the authors of change in perception of the relevance of the church, rather than reflecting something that had already spontaneously arisen. He suggests it's no coincidence that the years between 1961 and 4, which saw the sudden elite and perhaps predominantly Christian elite reinvention of modernity as secular, saw the beginnings of the catastrophic falls in the ecclesiastical statistics, citing evidence that clergy were conveying this modish but dubiously grounded language to their communities. So there's a complete loss of nerve or loss of confidence in what they're doing. The effect on clergy morale of the language of secularization was significant, Brewitt Taylor argues, and the whole honest to God debate was destabilizing. Robinson's supporters, David Edwards opined, are ready to declare themselves in favor of change, even when they do not see exactly where the process of change will end. And Brewitt Taylor points out that the result of this view was that any ideas perceived as traditional were subverted and the new legitimized, however vague and various it might be. Now, I've argued we always need careful attention to the present and new ways to engage a secularized society, and I'm going to say more about that next week. I'm going to demonstrate, however, in the next lecture that abandoning the parish system is not the way to do it, nor is embracing secularism's more malign features. I must stop there.